Welcome to episode 19 of Valley Girls. This week we are talking to Sari Botton, a Kingston based writer who has just come out with a brilliant memoir called And You May Find Yourself Confessions of a Late Blooming Gen X Weirdo. At the beginning of our interview, you'll hear that I joke with Sari that it's going to be either the best or worst interview she's ever had, which is mainly because we were just going to fangirl and tell her how much we liked her book and read passages at her. But that turned out to be both ironic and prescient because it was sort of the best and the worst. It was the best because Sari is a great guest, and I'm so excited for you to hear from her. It was the worst because my audio track got lost. So we were able to reconstruct some of the questions. So what you're about to hear is as close as possible to the original interview. Jenny's audio and Sari's audio were perfectly intact. It was just my track that got lost. So I've filled in the gaps the best I could, but that's part of the game. We're learning as we go on this podcast. Speaking of which, this is our next to last episode for season 1. We'll be back next week for one more episode and we'll give you lots more details then. We're taking a short break. We'll be back in August for season 2 with even more of what you love and a few changes to the show format. So thank you for being with us. Thank you for bearing with us as we learn how to be podcasters on this first season. And I hope you enjoy the conversation that we're about to have with Sari.
Welcome to the Valley Girls, the weekly podcast where we explore everything there is to see, do, try, eat, and experience in New York's Hudson Valley by talking to the makers, the doers, the growers, the creators, and all the unique voices of the Hudson Valley. We're telling the Hudson Valley's story one episode at a time. I'm Jenny Leifer, a lifelong Hudson Valley resident. When I'm not co-hosting Valley Girls, you'll find me talking all about health and wellness, finding the best gluten-free eats in the Hudson Valley, and giving back to the community through volunteerism and service.
And I'm Jennifer Santiago, a Hudson Valley native who has spent the past 20 years living in Texas. I'm currently splitting my time between Texas and the Hudson Valley as I'm in the process of moving back, and I'm so excited to explore and rediscover everything I love about the region, including hiking, history, and the local arts scene. As I have mentioned in previous episodes, the really cool thing about having a podcast is you can just think about the people you admire and look up to and wish you were friends with, and you have a reason to get in touch with them and ask them to come talk to you. So I decided to shoot my shot and invite a local writer I really love, and to my surprise and delight, she said yes.
It's true. We have both been fangirling pretty hard because today we are talking to Sari Botton. Sari Botton's memoir in essays, And You May Find Yourself, Confessions of a Late Blooming Gen X Weirdo, was chosen by Poets and Writers magazine for the 2022 edition of its annual 5 over 50 feature. For 5 years, she was the essays editor at Longreads. She edited the best-selling anthologies Goodbye to All That, Writers on Loving and Leaving New York, and Never Can Say Goodbye, Writers on Their Unshakable Love for New York. She publishes Ulster Magazine, Memoirland, and Adventures in Journalism. She was the writer-in-residence in the creative writing department at SUNY New Paltz for spring 2023. We are so pleased to have her here. Welcome, Sari.
Thank you. So happy to be here.
So this is going to be either the best interview or the worst interview you've ever had in your life, because mainly we're just going to read parts of your books at you and shriek about how much they love them and how relatable they are. And actually, at one point, we were both reading your memoir at the same time, and Jenny called me and said, "Is she in my head?" Because it is all extremely relatable. So it is really a delight to talk to you about your experiences and your writing.
Thank you. That's the whole reason I wrote it. I wanted to have people shriek and say, "Wait a minute, that's my story."
Well,
no, thank you so much.
And also, you talk a lot in the introduction to the memoir, And You May Find Yourself, which also major bonus points for Talking Heads lyrics. But you talk a lot about almost justifying it to yourself and to your reader when you say, who am I to think my story has value? Who am I to believe anyone will care about what I have to say? And I mean, we're case in point, we are why you do this. And I think why people write memoirs at all, which we'll talk a little bit more about memoirs in a bit.
So before I let Jen
Yeah,
loose asking about your writing, because she could talk all day about this, tell us how you came to be a resident of the Mid Hudson Valley. You've been here since 2005, is that right?
that's correct. I came up here after we lost our place in the East Village. We had this amazing undermarket loft on 8th and B in a former yeshiva. And it was right on Tompkins Square Park. It was 1,800 square feet. It was falling apart. And we had to fix everything ourselves, but it cost nothing. And we loved it. And then we got kicked out. So we weren't going to the suburbs. We weren't going to like Kew Gardens, which was, all we could afford for what we were paying. And so I had already spent a year up here. I had lived in Rhinebeck, Milan for half of 2000, half of 2001. Brian was from the Mid Hudson Valley and had a brother in Gardner and a sister in Saugerties. So this was where we were going to land. And yeah, we've been in the Kingston area for 19 years now. And we came here so fed up with our experience in housing court that we were happy to leave. But the longer I've been away from New York City, the more I've missed it. I do love it here and I feel very much at home, but I also miss my life in New York City tremendously.
Your story about moving upstate from the city is very similar to the one that we talked to Robert Burke Warren about. He was our very first guest on our very first episode, and he has written for Oldster magazine. So I believe you two know each other.
Yes, we do.
And he and his wife, Holly George Warren, who's also an author, had a very similar experience to yours, living in the East Village, got priced out, kicked out. The apartment was going through changes, and they ended up upstate. And he has made a great and creative life for himself and his family here. So, but it's very similar to what you were talking about. But speaking of Robert Burke Warren, he's just one of the many extremely cool people you have worked with. Um, I first fell in love with you when I found your anthology, Never Can Say Goodbye, Writers on Their Unshakable Love for New York. And that's one of two similar anthologies that you've got. You have another one called Goodbye to All That, Loving and Leaving New York. And so you had some really impressive lineup of contributors. You've worked with Nick Flynn, Elizabeth Gilbert, Susan Orlean. If you know her personally, please tell her that I am obsessed with the library book. It is life. Everyone should read that book. It's amazing. And Adele Waldman, whom incidentally I would very much like to interview. I just started her book, Help Wanted, her novel, and I loved her previous novel. So if you can hook me up, that'd be great.
I'll pass that along.
But so you write some things that really resonate about New York. In your own memoir, you talk about going into the city as a teenager, taking the LIRR in, and you say you're just walking around and doing nothing in particular, just absorbing the city's cityness, letting it keep changing me. I often say that New York City is where I became me. I've heard many other people say the same. And it was in those days that it began. In the very first essay in Never Can Say Goodbye, which was written by Roseanne Cash, called New York in the Mirror, she starts right off saying, I knew that New York City was my spiritual home from the age of 12. I felt territorial from the first moment I glimpsed the city. And I feel like that's a very common experience too. Like once you have lived in the city, it becomes part of you and you feel a kind of ownership over it as well.
100%. I was just looking at someone's photos on Instagram and I was instantly able to identify exactly where in Union Square the photo was taken. Like just the second I looked at it, I could tell exactly the angle of of Union Square. It immediately brought me back to, in that instance, a post 9/11 vigil that I went to, where I wound up meeting my quote unquote 9/11 boyfriend. Yeah. And um, I, at that moment, I thought, I look at these photos of New York City and it feels like I'm looking at home. There have been many places in my life that have been home. There was my childhood original home. There was a home I moved to when I was 15. Uh, you know, but there and where I live now is home too. I love my home in Kingston. However, the primary home in my consciousness is New York City, the East Village. It just I'm anchored there. My heart is anchored there. And it I don't think anything could ever replace it, even though I love where I live. And I don't know if I would have that same feeling if I started out there now, because it's a very different place than it was. Um, you know, I first moved there in 1987 for like 6 months. Then I moved there again in 93 or 94. And it was a different place than it is now. I still love going back, and I go back often as I can. And for me, there's a lot of nostalgia. Um, but it's hard to imagine what it would be like for me now because it's so expensive, and the neighborhood is has been seriously yuppified and theme parkified in a way, that I don't know I would if I would latch onto it in the same way today.
Definitely a special place. So, Sarah, you publish Ulster Magazine, as we mentioned, which is an online reader supported publication. Ulster Magazine's mission is destigmatizing and normalizing aging by demonstrating that it's happening to everyone of all ages, all the time, and fostering intergenerational conversation so we can all learn from one another. I love this so much as a Gen Xer who is really starting to think about aging and as a former hospice nurse. So this is a really big topic for me, so I will try to keep this short. But I feel this in many different ways. I love the interview. I've read like how you have the Ulster interview on aging. I think I'm not even going to go into the whole interview. Everybody go check this out. Read Ulster. Check out. I love everybody's different responses to it. When I think of, without getting into any detail, but when I think of my work with hospice patients and I think of those that I've worked with, it's very special work. But when I think of the work, especially at end of life, and the people who are most at peace at that moment, right, as they get close to end of life, the ones who I feel are most at peace are the ones who can say that they lived, right? That they fully live how much of life they experienced. It's not about their age. Some of them could have said that in their 70s. They weren't focused on what age they were at this point. So for me, the thinking of normalizing the aging process, but also this idea that we all have stories and we all have things to share, part of it is creating those stories and continuing to live. And I know that that's something that you also talk about, fostering this dialogue about aging among people of different ages and generations is such an important perspective. And I love the way that Ulster centers the voices of people in their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, in contrast to this expectation that once we hit a certain age, we should just go home and be quiet, right? And that's one thing that I see. That's one thing that I really look into that. And really, it's just there's something so powerful that when you can be at peace at any age at the end of your life and look back and say, I had a good full life. That's what it's really about. So it may be a different perspective. Obviously, I'm talking about end of life as opposed to the aging process. But from that perspective of somebody who can really, truly say that, I also just think that the stories, I've always said, I wish that I had the writing talent that you and other writers have. I would love to write a book of some of these stories, obviously. privacy, would be a factor. But these people had such amazing stories, how they lived, how they fully truly lived, and how they aged. They're not talking about stories from their younger years, which are interesting too. But I'm talking about stories from their 50s, their 60s, their 70s. And that's some of that, some of the most incredible stories is as they aged. So I love this. I love the concept of it and just the whole conversation and the dialogue that you open up with Ulster. So kudos and thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. And what important and fascinating work it must have been to be a hospice nurse.
Yeah,
Wow. Yeah.
really, really great work. But I just, as soon as I read that, I'm like, it just, a lot of things bring me back to that work. But that's kind of what it brought to for me. So yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, well, Ulster comes out of my curiosity about what other people's experiences are of getting older, because as you can even just glean from the title of my memoir, I feel like I'm different from everybody. I always feel weird. I feel like a weirdo. And part of that is that I've always been out of step with my peers. I've always done everything either too early or too late according to the culture, which made me want to ask people, well, what are you doing? How do you do age? And so the tagline for Oldster magazine is exploring what it means to travel through time in a human body at every phase of life. Because I really am exploring this, and I've been exploring it since I was 10. And my uncle came to my birthday party at a bowling alley on Long Island and said, "Oh, wow, you'll never be one digit again." And I just had my little mind blown. It was like, what? Wait, what? I can't go back the other way. I don't have a choice in this.
But I think that's part of it too, is when you think about end of life and you think about they're the most aware of that, right? There is no going backwards, and there might not be much forward, but they have those stories and they have the life that they have lived, and they still have value in sharing those stories. And that for me, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, is that there's so much value in for them, not only for me to hear it, which does bring value, but for them to share it. Just for having somebody to sit and listen to things that they have to share, they have something valuable to say in their stories. And so yeah, and I just love that. So
I think that's a really essential part of the human experience that we all share is loving to tell stories and loving to hear other people tell their stories. Do you think that's what led you to becoming a memoirist?
Well, I've always loved memoirs. I've been working in the memoir personal essay space for a very long time, on my own work and also editing other people, ghostwriting people's memoirs. I mean, I've really been in the memoir space since, I mean, since the 90s, early 90s. And I was the essays editor at Long Reads, and where it was personal essays, and we were contributors to something that was then called Memoir Monday, and it was edited by Lily Danziger. So she started it in 2017. She was an editor at the time at Narratively. And then in 2021, Lily came to me and said, "Do you want Memoir Monday? I've had enough. I don't want to do it anymore." It was just a weekly curation of personal essays from partner publications. There were no outside contributors. It was free. And I said, "I'll take it, but do you mind if I expand it and change it?" And she said, "Do whatever you want with it." So I then I changed it from Memoir Monday to Memoir Land, and it has 4 verticals, including there is still Memoir Monday. Every week on Monday, I present a list of personal essays from the partner publications and now also from other publications around the web. I also publish original essays in the first person singular section. I publish craft essays and interviews in the Lit Lab and also writing prompts. And then I have a new section called Goodbye to All That, where I publish New York stories, um, my own and other people's. So yeah, I'm running 2 magazines by myself. all the time, every week. Memoirland and Oldster. I'm publishing 3 to 4 pieces a week on each of them, mostly other people's voices. Um, it's a lot of work, but I love it. And we everybody needs a job, and so I made my own.
What is the appeal specifically about reading memoirs, especially when they're not the big splashy celebrity memoirs? Is there a little Schadenfreude? Is it voyeurism? Is it just hearing your own experiences in somebody else's words and knowing that it's a common experience?
I think the biggest thing is identification. Um, just like you guys are really identifying with what I wrote, and it's a feedback loop. So I helped you guys feel seen by writing something that you can identify with, and then you told me that I did that for you, and it made me feel seen. So I used to work with TMI Project, an organization here in the Hudson Valley. I worked with them for 8 years. I was involved in establishing their workshop, and I witnessed that all the time where the storytellers would tell a story on stage. People in the audience would say, "Oh my God, you told a story that is so close to mine. You made me feel seen. You helped me understand my experience. You gave voice to my experience." And then the storyteller would feel, "Wow, thank you for telling me that because I thought I was the only person in the world who went through what I went through." So that is, it creates this mirror. It's a two-way mirror. And it's so valuable because we all feel alone with our experiences, and learning that other people have had similar experiences helps us feel okay with ourselves, less alone. And also, the slight differences help us kind of maybe see our experiences slightly differently, maybe understand ourselves slightly differently. And that's incredibly valuable.
And I think that's what it's all about too. Like you said something that made me think about this, Sari, but it's for me, connection is like it's always my word. It's all about connection, human connection, connection among, cultures, connection of so many different types of connection. And so when you were saying something about that feedback loop, right? So it made us feel validated by seeing that, like, wow, we're not the only ones. This is so relatable. Your experiences are so relatable, even with the slight differences, in the details. Our situations are so relatable, our past, our experiences. And then that makes you feel, good because you had that impact and you were able to give that to us. And as Jen is talking about this here, there is just that connection, is just, I think that's really what it's all about. And that's absolutely what writing does. It helps, whether it is a memoir or if it's fiction, whatever it is, it's just it really does help that bit of human connection just a little bit more. So it's beautiful.
I live for that. That's my
Yes,
whole,
me too.
I've
Me
set my
too.
whole life
And
up
everyone
to,
lives for it.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and that's how, with I know you with your writing, and Jen too, and all her books. She's all about the literature and the books. And for me, it's like the human interactions, and that's why I'm a hospice nurse, and that's why I'm nursing. That's great.
So, Sari, in addition to all your own writing and teaching work, you're really plugged into the local literary scene. You work with a lot of local writers. You often do events at the local bookstores and local libraries. I know you recently did an In Conversation with Lucy Sante about her great memoir. You talked with Lynn Slater about her book, How to Be Old. So it seems like on top of all the other work you're doing, you're also a key part of building a community of writers here in the Hudson Valley area.
Thank you. There was something of a literary scene here before I got here. I can't take credit for, there have been some great writers here and some great, festivals and things. But from the minute I got here, I tried to establish some additional literary community here. And I really got into full swing. In 2017, I opened a co-working space for writers. Um, and I had that for 3 years. Originally, it was in the Opera House on Fair Street in Uptown. Then I moved it to the Fuller Building in Midtown. And then I closed it in March 2020 because you can't co-work, in a small space in a pandemic. And it has been really hard for me to reestablish what I had with Kingston Writers Studio. That's what it was called, Kingston Writers Studio. It wasn't just a place to work. We would also have events. I'd have pizza parties. I also would have um, an evening event called Sip and Write. And initially, the Sip and Write evenings were in the studio. Eventually, I moved them to Rough Draft. I was uh, hosting the Sip and Write evenings at Rough Draft in like 2018, 2019. I also was hosting, I was doing some in conversations with them as part of a residency that they were doing. So I've tried to be involved in expanding literary community here for a long time. And as part of TMI Project, we used to have story slams. I've been involved in Martha Frankel's Woodstock Book Festival and her story slams for a long time. And so I just wanted to find a way to have more of that. I've been working in that vein for a long time, but it's been very hard to reestablish post pandemic. For a while in 2020, or 2021, I was pulling people together for drinks outside places, during the pandemic. And it was fun, but it just took so much work. And I was going through so much, with the isolation. It was so hard. I would also often have the writer community of Kingston come for backyard fires at my house during the pandemic. It was really nice. Most of my friends are writers. Um, so anyway, I'm still looking for ways to reconnect, re-strengthen those bonds with other writers up
I
here.
think a few of my friends used to do the writers workshop. I know Sarah Eckel. I know she was involved with that for a while.
Yeah, she was a member of the
Yeah,
studio.
yeah.
Yeah,
I know.
she's a good
Oh, yeah. I
friend.
know her through another friend of mine, Colleen Connors, who I know was involved for a while with that as well.
Yes, I know her too.
Yeah,
Yep.
that's great.
So that sense of community is really important. And I think that writing tends not to be as much of a solitary undertaking as people think it is. And it often helps to have that community for some accountability to keep you going when things get tough.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, the Kingston Writer Studio, we did offer workshops. And like I had Melissa Phoebos come and teach a workshop. I had Chloe Caldwell and other people, but mainly it was a co-working space. It was a way to bump into other writers. I was trying to give myself some of what I lost by leaving New York City. In New York City, I could go to a cafe and just work for a while and bump into friends, or I could freelance and go to an office in Midtown and meet new people. I didn't have that up here. And so I wanted to create a place where we could work side by side. Like it was sort of like parallel play among toddlers. We'd say hi to each other, get our work done, and then maybe go to lunch together or maybe go out for a drink after work. And I haven't been able to replace that for myself since the pandemic.
There's actually a lot of research, especially in the space around ADHD and autism and other neurodivergent conditions, something called body doubling, where it can be a really effective strategy just to work alongside someone else in a shared space, not necessarily collaborating with them on anything, maybe not even talking, but just the physical presence of another person as your body double can really be a tool for helping you focus.
I never heard that term before, but it resonates. I often derive focus from other people's focus. It's very contagious. And so I got a lot of work done at the studio. It was mostly my day job or maybe a personal essay here and there. I couldn't have written my book there. I really needed some isolation, and the pandemic gave it to me. But yeah, I'm going to look into body doubling. I know that I recently published a questionnaire on Memoirland from Jamie Nakamura Lynn, and she talked about a website where people do that body doubling.
Hmm. Yeah, that's so interesting. But I love the idea of the writer studio. And like you're saying, even if you're just there, the body doubling, whatever it is, just to have that camaraderie and that support, even if you're just doing your thing when somebody else is doing the same thing right next to you. And if you did want to bounce ideas off of each other, but just to have that camaraderie.
It's called Cave Day. It's a place where it's accountability and like working online.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's called Cave Day.
I'll have to look that up now. That's cool. Okay, so last but not least, your latest book, and you may find yourself, which you call confessions rather than essays. So I mean, we talked a little bit before we even started recording because Jen and I couldn't even wait to tell you what we thought about it before we even started, the official recording of the podcast. But just the honesty, the vulnerability, the authentic nature of how you write. And I think for me, it's that conversational style writing that you have where we have never met. And I felt like I was reading like notes from a friend, like you had just written me this note of what had happened. It's so relatable. I can't say enough about it. The conversations too, as I say, I call them conversations, the confessions themselves, the essays themselves, the topics that you go into, even if the actual details may not resonate specifically with people or may not be as relatable, but the topics themselves, the aging and mortality and friendships and relationships in general. There's body image discussions, which leads to eating disorders. The whole idea of societal pressure for women to have children. There's just so much, and the overarching idea of finding our own voice and how to be our own person, having that self-awareness and trying to have that self-compassion, that self-approval, all while going through all of it. It was just the whole thing for me. And some of us are late bloomers and we're right there with you. So we get it. Right? Jen and I are both late blooming Gen X weirdos. So we completely feel you. But there's just, I just have to call out a couple of things that I outlined just because I just could not believe it. There were so many things, and one of them I had read you before, so I'm going to skip ahead to it. But it was when I woke up and discovered I had no idea what I was doing or why. I realized I'd been on autopilot, making choices based on what I thought I should want, and more concerned with other people's satisfaction than my own. Each time I made a decision, I was guided by the unconscious motivation to keep others content. My husband, my parents, my bosses, anyone else with more power than me, so they'd be pleased with me and reward me with praise and validation, which would give me a kind of emotional boost I confused with happiness. I just, there it is. That just sums up so much for me. So I know Jen has a lot of others. I have others I'd like to share too, but so beautiful.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear it. I wrote this book thinking that women like you would relate to it. I dedicate it to the messy women, but what's the moments, not to give men too much sway again, but when men say to me that they identified with things in my book, it tells me that I've reached a level of universality is maybe overplayed, but I've touched on something very relatable and human. One of my favorite stories about someone really getting what I was talking about was I took a lift to an event in the city. My driver was a 30-year-old Indian man. And he said, "Oh, what are you doing?" I told him I was going to do a book event. I was going to do a reading. "Oh, what's your book about?" And I told him, that it's kind of like a midlife coming of age story about like really coming to myself after first going in a lot of the wrong directions because of what I thought I should do. And he said, "Like what?" And I told him, "Well, my first marriage, I married who I should. And then I, realized that it wasn't right for me and I had to get out and I realized I just wasn't being myself." And he said, "Oh my God, this is me." And he said, I'm 30. He said, last year I called off an engagement. My parents said I had a year to get my act together. It was an arranged marriage. I and he's like, my year is going to be up and I don't want to go back. I don't want to live the life they want me to live. And as we were talking, he ordered my book on his
Oh,
iPhone.
wow.
He was like, I need this book. And but I've had a number of male podcasters interview me and say that they identified with certain aspects of the book. So it's not just, and I've also had a lot of much younger response. I've had some women in their 20s say, I am not the demographic for this book, but I totally get it. And I really appreciated it. And I've had a few of those reviews posted online, and it's made me feel like, okay, I'm really touching on something very, very human. It's not just Gen X cis het women.
Yeah, it's definitely not just Gen X. However, I see so many women coming up behind us who do seem to have it a bit more together than I know I did at their age. And hopefully, reading something like this can also be an instruction manual for them of how not to. So, we recently interviewed on the podcast Lola Kalade. She is a writer and she has a podcast and a Substack newsletter called The New New. And she's really empowering, badass content. Much younger than us. She just turned 30, and she is just so poised and confident and together in a way that I was not at 30. And so I'm hoping that she is representative of her generation, and maybe their memoirs that they write when they're in their 50s will be much different than this one, and they won't have the same stories about, as you say, twisting themselves into a pretzel to get the approval of men, for example. But also, I think that it's sort of a way to reconnect with our younger selves and look back on who we are, and hug that little girl who thought that she was doing the right thing. I often think about Gretchen Rubin, who's a podcaster and an author, and one of her know yourself better questions is, what did you do for fun when you were 10 years old? And I feel like that's a really insightful way to think about who you really are, what really sparks your joy. And so, I hope that your memoir, or your confessions, as you say, can help us reconnect with our younger selves and also help the generations behind us to not make the same mistakes we made in the same way we made them.
No, it really is. And I'm glad you reminded me of that, because sometimes I lose my way and I forget that I'm trying to connect with my inner 10-year-old. And I recently took a cartooning class, and
We loved
so
it.
much
We loved the idea.
fun.
We love the cartoon you made.
Thank you. And it was just sitting down with crayons. It's pure joy. And I'm back to who I really am. It's just really, so I'm trying to find ways to reconnect with that person, that version of me all the time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So a few things that came up while you were just talking about that. First of all, it's interesting that you use the word, I don't know, you said, I don't know if I should go as far as to say universality, but literally in my notes, when I'm reading, and I have all my notes about how I feel about this, relatable, authentic, universal. Those are like the first three things that I have written down, the relatable, authentic, universal.
Wow.
And it's not universal among women. It's universal. I absolutely agree with that. I won't name names because they may be listening. I hope they're listening to my podcast. I won't name names, but I can think of a few men in my life that I absolutely think would relate to some of the themes in this book for sure. And Jen, when you said something about, the reasons why, we may have stayed in situations that we knew weren't right for us, we knew for a fact, but it's like we felt stuck, right? We had this sense of being stuck. We're here. Now what do we do? Because this is what's expected of us. There was another aspect for me that's for sure true. I have done that throughout my life. But one aspect for me that really rang true was when you were talking about Chris in the book, and that there was one paragraph that you said, one potent ingredient of that love was pity. Unfortunately, that night I didn't recognize what a slippery slope that presented for me. It was a key component of my attachment to one beautiful mess after another, this feeling sorry for them. It nudged me to absolve them of all responsibility and opened the door for me to wrest control. A subtle, unspoken transaction. My internal superhero emerged from the shadows to save them, whether or not they wished to be saved. Often they stated their preference not to be, which had the opposite of the desired effect. I only became more insistent. That right there just sums up my entire life. It doesn't matter whether you think I'm here to save you. I'm going to save you. And that's why I'm here. That's why I was put in your life. And even if it's going to break me, even if it's going to destroy me, I will stay to save you. And even if it's not good for me. So yes, that is just, so being stuck and having to fix people. That was
That was the
very
hardest
much,
chapter to write of all of them.
I can
That
understand.
and Hurricane Tim. Those, well,
Mm.
no, that and Hurricane Tim and the eating disorders one and the Mean Girls one. Okay, it was hard to
Okay.
write. Um, but
Yeah.
yeah, that one in particular was hard to write because I had to really look hard at myself. You know, it was
Yes.
probably my most destructive relationship, my most toxic relationship. Um, and very easy to blame the addict in the room, but I was also, complicit in everything. And and I could have not gone back. I needed to go back that last time so that I would know for sure that this could never work, because otherwise my entire life I would have been harboring, the curiosity, a torch. No. Uh-uh. I had to get hurt really badly, and I did. But I also had to be able to look at, well, why was I there again? Why was I, participating in this after, with someone who had hit me and had hit me again, and also was verbally abusive and, like, you know and intermittently very loving and seductive and magnetic and charming.
Oh,
But what was I doing there, and what was my role? And that was so hard to write. I had to rewrite and rewrite, and also I worked really hard to blur that person. I blurred that person so well that my best friend said to me, "When did you date a painter?" And I said, "I never dated a painter." And she said, "Well, what did you write about?" I said, "That was," and I gave the real name. And she's like, "Wow, I did not recognize that person." And that to me told me I did my job. I made it more about a phenomenon than about me and that particular person. And also, I made it more about my behavior and what was keeping me there, which is really what I wanted to examine, which is really what memoir is about. Like real memoir is not about that person did that to me or this extraordinary thing happened in my life. It's about examining our human tendencies. That's what it is. And so that chapter, in that chapter, I really had to examine some very unflattering tendencies of mine. Um, yeah,
yeah, I get self-awareness. That's what I said in the beginning.
yeah.
That's There's so much self-awareness that must have been part of that process, and it comes through. And yeah,
I was trying to
I'm sure.
convey that I was an addict. I was addicted to an addict. I was
Yes,
addicted to rescuing an
you were
addict.
addicted to rescuing. Yes, yes, to being needed to, yes, to rescuing.
When you are talking about being with addicts and how you swore off alcohol because you were in relationships with people who had alcohol addictions, there you wrote something that really resonated, and I think it will resonate with anybody who's ever had that rescue complex. And it never occurred to me before how truly egotistical that really is, to think that you're going to be the one to save this person.
Mm-hmm.
But you wrote, "How vital I imagined I was to another's well being, what power I could have, all while appearing saintly and superior."
It is wild.
Yeah, I mean, it's so similar to a situation that I had, and Jen would tell me time and time again, "Who do you think you are? Like, nothing's gonna change here." I'm like, "No, no, 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 but it is, because in between, there's all these lovely moments, and there's all these times where things are so wonderful, and it's gonna be different now." right? And
Yeah.
then, yes, reading it from the other point of view of like, wow, that's what I was doing. That is what I was doing.
When you're deep in it, you can't see it. And there were other people I knew who were doing similar things, and I would look at them and be like, "What are you doing?" But I was so deep in, and also this was such an old, we had known each other so many years. We had been on and off, and we had also been friends. There was so much underpinning to this that it was hard to see my way clear. Um, yeah, I'm just so glad I'm way out of that.
And one thing that Jen said about, it's so interesting, that younger people may be reading this, younger generations. And I do wonder, like you said, you hope maybe the younger generations, society and culture has maybe changed just enough to not repeat the cycles, you hope, right? And would it have been different? What if I had read something like this back then? Would I have gone through the motions differently? Would I have gone through the patterns differently, or was it my pattern to go through until I was ready to find myself?
Yeah, I
I
mean,
don't
in a
know.
way, I was writing a book I wish I could have read,
Yes,
which
exactly.
is what a lot of memoirists do. I see
Yeah.
memoirists say this all the time. The book I needed didn't exist, so I wrote it. Um, which also goes back to there's a Salinger quote from Raise High the Roof Beams Carpenters. Seymour Glass writes to Buddy, his brother, and says, you know, writing is easy. Just think of the book that doesn't exist that you need and write it.
Mm, I love that.
I mean, I hesitate to quote Salinger because he was a maniac and a pedophile who drank his own
Yeah,
urine.
right.
However, he was a good writer.
Oh man.
Well, that could be a whole other conversation of how you parse that when you love the art but hate the artist.
Mm.
That's been coming up a lot for me lately too. Um, I'm not going to name names, but certain beloved authors who have behaved very badly now in public, and how does that change how we're allowed to feel about their output, which we've loved so much for so long.
Oh yeah, yeah. I want to get Claire Dederer's book about that.
Yes, I just saw that. Something about monsters.
Yeah, it's called Monsters: A Fan's Dilemma.
A fan's dilemma. Yes. Gosh, somebody just told me about that. But the last thing I will say about this, and then I'm done with Chris. But no, the last thing I will say about this also is just that how amazing it is that there are times in our life where we have to go through certain patterns. But it also, as much as you can look at it and say this book was written based on my own, it has to be more about my actions and my behaviors and all of that. Same throughout life, it has to go through your own patterns and until you are ready, and then you finally say, I am mentally, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, I am ready. And then it is amazing what opens up, whether that is through age or time or maturity or whatever it is, the stars align when we are ready. And I too have found my partner and all of that. And it's not just about relationships and love. It's about all of it. Everything lines up. But that's another part of what I found and I got out of it. And I know everybody's going to get something a little different, but it is very validating, that feeling of it doesn't matter. Late blooming, you can call it whatever you want. But when you are ready, when you have gone through what you were meant to go through and you have shed that and you are ready to walk through it, that you will be ready and you'll find that time. So, yeah, beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
Well, Sari, thank you so much for being here and talking with us today. We could obviously talk to you for hours, so we will definitely have to have you back on. We've got links to Sari's books in the bookshop on our website, valleygirlspodcast.com. Anything purchased through our shop link comes from bookshop.org, which supports independent bookstores. So choose your local favorite, or you can just choose to support all the member bookstores. You can also follow Sari on Instagram at Sari Botton, and also check out at Oldster_mag. Is that correct? Did I do
Yep.
that right?
Hmm.
Oldster_mag. We will have all of those links at valleygirlspodcast.com. Sari, it has been such a pleasure. Love talking to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me on. It was wonderful chatting with you guys. You guys are pretty cool too.
uh,
Thank you.
Thank you to all our listeners. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to help support the Valley Girls, please follow our podcast from our show page on whichever platform you listen from. Leave a rating and review, and please spread the word and share our podcast with others. We really appreciate your support. To stay up to date with the Valley Girls and for more content, you can find us at valleygirlspodcast.com, and you can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Links to all our social media accounts are in the show notes. And you can also connect to them through our homepage at valleygirlspodcast.com. Thank you so much for listening. Bye for now.
bye-bye.
The music for this episode is by Robert Burke Warren, entitled Painting a Vast Blue Sky, and can be found on his album Redheaded Friend, available on iTunes and Spotify, and at the link in the show notes.